Monster Professor.
Welcome to The Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. We're going to dig deep, so be prepared. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And today, in response to popular demand, we're going to talk about ghosts.
Let me tell you something. Bustin' makes me feel good. I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
At first, I was surprised to find out that far and away the most common request I got was for an episode about ghosts. And then I started thinking, wait, what percentage of the population have ghosts in their real life, as a part of their real lives? I found on a very quick search a Huffington Post omnibus poll that said of those people where they asked people, do you believe in ghosts? Do you think the spirits of the dead can hang around and linger and communicate with people? 45% said yes, and 32% were of the not sure, maybe. And so 68% of their polling population were into the idea, or could be. Have you ever seen one, been in the presence of one? 28% said yep. 59% were not sure. I mean, maybe. So that's 41% open to that idea. I think that's pretty interesting, but of the Monster Professor listeners, that might be quite a bit higher. I don't know. So what kind of ghosts should we talk about? Oh man, so many cool ones. My mind is immediately going to one of the coolest ghosts I've seen on film visually. It's a movie called The Devil's Backbone, and it's by Guillermo del Toro. And this is, like a lot of his films, especially his earlier films, there's really fascinating personal films. And this is an orphanage. This is set in an orphanage in Spain, kind of still racked by the problems of the Spanish Civil War that were left behind after World War II. And there's this kid named Santi who drowns, and his ghost is still around in this orphanage, causing problems, causing terror. But like a lot of ghost stories, is one of these kinds of ghosts that wants to be solved. I call them solvable ghosts, but where something went wrong and they need some people on the world of the living to fix it for them. So Santi is one of these, and my God, he's terrifying and amazing looking. So Guillermo visually, what he did was mix the look of a drowned person or someone floating in water with that same idea that ghosts float around and are semi-transparent, so that when Santi's walking down the dark hallway to you, or even just standing there, he's kind of floating and half transparent in that way in which he looks like he's in water, or maybe he's just etheric, and it's horrifying but kind of inviting at the same time. It's fascinating. Guillermo del Toro is one of those directors who is all about showing the monster. He doesn't subscribe to that, the early Spielberg Jaws thing of not showing the monster. Although Spielberg only did that out of necessity, by the way. They were planning on showing the shark the whole time through the filming of Jaws, but problems came about in the transportation of them. They didn't have them. They didn't have the big animatronic or foam thing to shoot. And so they're like, let's just fake it with noise and camera angles and stuff, which ended up being awesome. But Guillermo del Toro loves looking at monsters and showing them. Hey, by the way, Guillermo, if you're listening to this, you're open invitation to be on The Monster Professor. Maybe I'll be able to wrangle you for a few minutes someday. Okay, so, Santi was a fantastic looking one on film, but I think we have to talk about perhaps one of the more famous ghosts on film in Ghostbusters, the 80s film, Oh Slimer. I don't think he was called Slimer in the original script. I think it went something like he was called the Onion Head Ghost or something like that among the production crew and script writers, because he was a ghost who stunk in the storyline of it. But the Ghostbusters, by the way, is a nearly I'll go ahead and say it's a perfect film. It's fantastic. If you haven't seen it since it came out in the 80s, or you haven't seen it in years and you're into monsters, go back and watch that thing, because it totally works on that whole kind of silly surface level type of thing. But it works like at much deeper levels than that too. I mean, the building that they talk about, Ivo Shandor having built, that's channeling Gozer, this returned Mesopotamian god, the paranormal science behind it, and that it was built from the same metals with the same geometric structure that deep space telescopes use to peer into the hearts of dead stars deep into the cosmos. Like, that's in the movie Ghostbusters when they're talking about that stuff. It's really cool stuff. And so Dan Aykroyd apparently was really into the paranormal at the time. So you got a big time player in that movie taking this stuff seriously, even though it's also primarily a comedy film. It's really cool. The only thing I want changed about it, though, is in the background through the whole movie, I want the marketing advertising for the Stay Puft Marshmallows to be a little bit clearer. You know how they have in RoboCop, how they have the "I'd buy that for $1" commercial in the background constantly playing, like a Greek chorus in a play. I want the Stay Puft image to like be on billboards and on commercials and stuff in the background, so it's in the back of our heads. So when Ray Stans accidentally mentally blurts out this cute little advertising icon that comes to be their form of their destruction, I want it to be in the back of our heads too. Maybe they can go back and put that in somewhere. And if George Lucas does it to ruin films, why can't we do it to make them better? Okay, so where was I? Oh, talking about Slimer. So he's that fat, hungry little ghost. What kind of person was he before he died and turned into a ghost? A dude that like runs around hotel rooms, eats off of other people's room service trays, and then gets around in New York and sees how many hot dogs he can shove in his mouth. Like, what kind of guy was this before he died and became this ghost version of himself? It turns out, like, behind the scenes on the set, they joked that it was what John Belushi's character in Animal House would have been had he been a ghost, and so they informally called him John Belushi's ghost, which is hilarious to me. We should get into maybe let's get a little like deeper historical about it, back into like the real belief of ghosts rather than just they're showing up in films. This idea that the dead are around us and we can kind of communicate with them through seances, and that when you die, maybe you hang around, or maybe your spirit is like going through a process of evolution, as in becoming better and more aware of the secret workings of the universe, not just going to heaven or purgatory or hell or hanging around waiting to be resurrected, but instead going to a higher plane of existence, but you can still hang out and communicate with others. All of that are the essential beliefs of spiritualism, and that came about in the mid-1800s, particularly because of the first kind of seances by a group of 3 sisters called the Fox Sisters. And they're a fascinating story. They started doing these seances in which they would say that the ghosts of the dead are communicating with them through knocking of the table during these these sessions, and then like ringing of bells, and that evolved as other people picked it up into like automatic writing, where the ghost would take over the hand of the medium and write out messages, or even speak through the medium. They started doing those kinds of readings and communicating in 1848. And it started in upstate New York, or western New York, in this district that is called the Burnt Over District. It's called the Burnt Over District because so many religious revivals and new religious movements and new utopian movements all started in that same little particular area. And it was also really rich with a bunch of folklore, like if you hear odd knocking, that's the dead trying to tell you something. And that was a lot of local folklore there. But I mean, just about one generation prior, about 20 years, 25 years before the Fox sisters got like world renowned for their starting spiritualism, you got the birth of Mormonism with John Smith, who was originally kind of a dowser, occultist, treasure hunter, and taught so by his father, started getting messages from angels and seeking out golden tablets and starting a religion. There, it's also the same area where the Shakers started up, the Millerites started up, which are still Millerism is still hanging around that because that created other sects like Jehovah's Witnesses. All of that started in that same area and that's why they called it the Burnt Over District, as in the fire of rebirth and revelation just keeps happening in this same little area. A whole bunch of utopian communes all started there. And so here come the Fox sisters out of that same area, and it really started spreading into other religions and across the world, as in this is the way to envision the place of the living as it's connected to the dead. And although there was some Christian resistance to it up until this date, 2018, I think a lot of people who would consider themselves religious seamlessly incorporate all these ideas of spiritualism, and that your dead loved ones are still around and they can still hear you, and maybe you can communicate with them or they can communicate with you, and they know a little bit more about the workings of the world because they're dead. All that kind of spiritualism stuff, I don't think anybody sees it as incompatible. One occult writer, a guy named John Michael Greer. He's a writer of many things, but he's also a druid in the West Coast. Maybe I'll get him on the show one day if he would be for it. He claims that spiritualism threatened to take over as the primary religion of America, at least the United States of America, at least. Didn't exactly go down that way, but at the very least, mid-1800s to late 1800s, it was taken over like wildfire. And I mean, you even have seances in the White House with Abraham Lincoln's wife. The Winchester House, we'll have to get into that one soon with an episode on the Gothic. But I mean, that is at the heart of that. And so this whole spiritualism thing has stuck around, and I think that part of the theory behind ghosts and what they actually are is best described by several different cultures, but I think occultists describe it clearly in that what you're seeing when you encounter a ghost is someone between their second and third deaths. So what the heck is a second death and a third death? Well, the first death is the one that you know about, right? Where your body's dead, your body dies, and then that's it. But there's this idea that your essence hangs around and is connected to an etheric body. Now, your true essence or your spirit isn't the same as your etheric body, in the same way that your etheric body isn't the same as your physical body, but it's what links the two. And that takes a little while longer to die out and decay after your body dies. And so you still have this link to the area where you died or even your body. And it takes roughly 3 days for your etheric body to dissolve away or to be dissolved away by etheric larvae. These are these kinds of autonomous but non-sentient beings that creep around imperceptible to living people and then devour what left husks of etheric bodies in the same way that like insects would devour a dead body. It's this like a paranormal ecosystem, so to speak. I think that's how John Michael Greer refers to it, as a paranormal ecosystem, and these kinds of things work out like that. Some of these spirits who are hanging around because their etheric bodies haven't gone away will hold on tighter and stay longer if their death was traumatic or tragic in some way, or too sudden, or if something about their willpower and their mind wants to hang on to this world with a lot of strength and power, then that second death doesn't fully happen yet, and they can't move on to another realm, and so they hang around where they should no longer be lingering, and that's what you get with ghosts. I think that's pretty cool and terrifying, I think. I mentioned earlier that there's this common feature that I call solvable ghosts, in which they're just hanging around so that some wrong done to them can be brought to light or to justice, or something about them wasn't done properly, like their burial wasn't proper and they're hanging around till they get a proper burial. That kind of thing has been around for a long time. Pliny writes of it, the ancient historian writes of a Greek philosopher who was just looking for some place to get some peace and quiet so he could work on his philosophical studies and his writing. And he found this old place that had really cheap rent because the ghost kept bothering everybody. And they told him, like, look, there's a ghost here. He's like, well, I'm way too rational to be bothered by anything like that. I'm a philosopher. Athenodros, I think his name was. I'm looking at it right now. Was it? Pliny's dude, Athenodros. I don't know if we know much more about his philosophy than he was the one who encountered the ghost. But anyway, at night he would work, and then the ghost would come shambling up the stairs into his study, and he'd have these shackles and chains, and he'd rattle them and he would moan, and the philosopher would just like get annoyed, and it was bothering his work, and he would stare at him and the ghost wouldn't say anything, and then he keeps working, and so the ghost keeps bothering him and just like trying to motion him along. And so philosopher's like, fine, okay. So he gets up reluctantly and follows him rather in a bored manner, as I read it, down to the courtyard where the ghost is like indicating somewhere in the ground, and then dissipates. And then finally the philosopher at daylight digs up that spot, finds the murdered guy or the dead guy's bones, and then gives it a proper burial. And the ghost is fine. That's it. He goes on to other realms of being, and then he's fine. And that's what, thousands of years old that one is. And you see that same kind of thing in a whole lot of ghost stories, I think. But that kind of chain rattling ghost, I mean, you get that with probably one of the more famous ghosts out of literature, which would be Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley's Rattling Chains, and Charles Dickens, of course, connects those chains to his character, as in chains carrying like cash boxes and all these other kind of locks, because he was a greedy guy, and that's why he's getting punished. But I think it's interesting that book, in which these this ghost comes to a living guy and telling him, now I know I have more wisdom now that I am dead. Change your ways. Here's a message from the dead of how to transcend your lowly state and be better. That came out in 1843? Probably not to America until about 1844 when it started really getting popular and selling well. And so that's 4 years before the Fox sisters started claiming to communicate with the dead for real, in which they would get these kinds of self-improvement messages. That's pretty fascinating. I mean, that Burnt Over district was known for drumming up a whole lot of really edgy but progressive ideas. I mean, that's where the women's rights movement really started getting going. That's where a lot of the American pushes for abolition of slavery got going. And so some fantastic ideas came out of that area. Time out for a personal story tangent. Have I seen a ghost? I remember seeing a ghost. I remember it as sharply as I have any other memory in my head. And I'm also simultaneously convinced that I did not really see it. So do with that psychological problem what you will. That cognitive dissonance is probably enough to break normal people's minds. But I have no problem being wildly contradictory. And so I have this memory of I was a little kid, and I was with a neighbor. Playing with a neighbor friend of mine, and her mom took us to the grocery store, and so we got in her Jeep and drove on the way to the grocery store. On the side of the road, there's one of these power boxes that they have like in this fence, and the fence was half torn down, and on the ground there was this dead man lying who was only there from the waist up. His legs were gone, and he was kind of leaning on his arms, and his head and his face was staring blankly, and he had this gray skin and like a plaid shirt, and he was just so obviously dead and torn in half, as if there had been some sort of big crash there. And I remember us all freaking out at seeing this, and we were driving past all this and going to the store, and then on our way back, the fence is back up. There's no half torn apart man there, nothing. And then later I hear that that's where there was a semi-truck wreck and the truck driver died there. And I remember seeing it. I remember the mom freaking out and the other kid freaking out, and I was freaking out. But then I'm thinking, there's just no way. Why did we just continue to the store? And was that mom just messing with me and telling me stuff? And I had a great imagination. I was so young. I don't know, but it was terrifying to me. I've lived in some houses before, and there was this one old house, and I was renting the upper floor to it. It was on Elm Street, by the way. This really old house. And all these weird sounds kept happening. Like there was no one, the people below us had moved out. And so there's no one living below us, no other access to this house. And yet in the middle of the day, we would hear an old piano playing. And so we'd go all through the house, checking for this kind of thing, and even looking through the windows of the bottom floor, and it was all empty down there, and I have no idea where that came from. Or there would be different times where we'd be walking up the stairs to the apartment, or even in the middle of the night, and suddenly there was this extremely loud and distinct shattering of glass. And we had some like glass vases and stuff sitting around, and we had cats, so the obvious reaction was running after it to find out what the cats knocked over and broke, and go through the whole house, and you can't find any. And we had hardwood floor, so it makes sense that it would shatter really loudly. But we went through the whole house 2 or 3 times this happened and could not find any shattering glass. And so we were both convinced that the place was haunted and it had something to do with piano playing and glass shattering. It's a really old house, at least 100 years old. Well, I remember being just so terrified night after night, and this is as I'm an adult, right? So terrified of just seeing this ghost walk past the bedroom door or walk through the hallways at night. And I would lose sleep and like be tired at work and just wish for a normal life again in which I didn't have to deal with ghosts until I finally got it. Over it and then eventually moved and then realized, man, life was so much cooler when I thought I had ghost problems. I wish I could have a ghost again. Oh man, because the mundane world is not nearly as cool. Okay, that was a long tangent. Sorry about that. Tangent and done. What other ghosts should I talk about? Oh, I'll tell you a ghost story that really threw me for a loop because I had no idea I was reading a ghost story. It was Gogol's story, The Overcoat, this Russian writer and he wrote this story called The Overcoat, which is wildly influential to other writers. I think as Dostoevsky once said, we all come out of Gogol's overcoat, as in like every important Russian writer was primarily influenced by that story, and it's fantastic. I've just pretty much ruined it for you, by the way, if you've never read it before. Sorry about that, because for like 90% of this very long story, it's about this pathetic little pencil-pushing pseudo-bureaucrat fella who is doing everything he can to struggle just to get enough money to get a better overcoat. To get him through these harsh Russian winters, and so he won't be as sick and as uncomfortable. And he finally does, and he goes deep into debt for it. And all you want to do is just buy that poor little fella an overcoat, and everybody treats him like crap. And he finally gets one, and then like he's done wrong and by people mistreating his overcoat, and then it's finally stolen from him, and no one will help him out, and no one cares, especially the one person who could. And then he gets a cold and he dies, and that's it. And it's so sad. And then as people keep walking across this bridge at night, this ghost keeps chasing after him and ripping their coats off of him, and suddenly it turns into this terrifying ghost story in which this poor little pathetic man is now this horrible, vengeful ghost ripping the coats off of people. And he finally rips off the coat of the guy who did him most wrong, terrifies him, and he seems to be satisfied at the end. Really threw me for a loop. I'm like, what in the heck's going on? That this like really mundane story turned into a creepy ghost story. We have all sorts of cultural ghost stories too. In America, we definitely have this really consistent story of the ghostly hitchhiker, in which somebody who knew somebody who, it's never the person the person telling you this is never the happened to them, like somebody else knew somebody else, and so when you retell it, you just cut out the other person, so it's always somebody telling you about what somebody else told you. And they picked up a hitchhiker, and a lot of times it's this young lady, sometimes it's a young man, and they look cold and pale, and they're mysterious, and it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and then they drop some weird hints, and they won't communicate with you much, and it's sometimes about a dance or a prom or a lost love or the cold and the wet and something like that, and then they disappear from the car, or sometimes you drop them off, and then they disappear in the rearview mirror, and you find out later that that's the exact same person who died just a year before at that same spot on the way to a high school dance or some sort of like tryst or something. They were going to meet their true love, but they died, unfortunately, something like that. That shows up all over the place. But this idea that we've got drowned people coming back as ghosts a lot, that's really consistent across the world as far as I can tell. Like in Buddhism, the tradition of the hungry ghost, and Taoism, especially the Chinese versions, it gets lesser out in Buddhism outside of China, but they'll have hungry ghost festivals. in which they'll do various things to celebrate the dead, but to also appease the hungry ghosts, which are the hungry is the really bad but cool translation of this kind of voracious anger that they want something more out of the world of the living. They'll have these festivals in which they'll like put on dances and presentations, but the front rows will be left empty so that the hungry ghosts can attend and watch and be entertained. You're not supposed to say their word for ghost during this period. And you're definitely not supposed to swim. Whatever you do, do not swim, because that's where a lot of the people who drowned are just waiting to drag you down into the water. And that's where I guess a lot of other ghosts hang out. I mean, Santi was an example of that too. So we see that kind of drowned ghost thing quite a bit. But ghosts show up in all sorts of stories. I mean, even Toni Morrison's Beloved, which won just about every imaginable modern literary award, it's a ghost story, isn't it? I mean, it starts out with a haunted house because of this ghost, and like the family members are leaving because of the ghost, and then a mysterious girl rises up out of the water. Once again, ghosts and water, and she has no name, and they name her the name of the only name they have for the dead baby who's haunting them. And is she the returned dead? Like, what is this? And so that's, at some level, at least, and at the beginning level, at the very least, that's a ghost story. But I mean, you have it all over the place. And Canterville Ghost. Oh, Hamlet's father. God, how can I forget Hamlet's father? Oh, man. Like, he's one who has to spend all day in hell. You could say maybe purgatory. Either way, it's a really unpleasant, burning place. But at night, he gets to walk around his old castle. And he does so in order to get out the message to his son. Like, look, I've been murdered by your uncle. He's taken over. And I need you to get revenge for me. And even though he gets this kind of direct confirmation, Hamlet's like, yeah, but I don't know if I should listen to him. I don't know how true it is. Let me just overthink everything for 5 acts and until everyone's dead. But Hamlet's, and it was said that Shakespeare, that was the one role that he always wanted to play personally, was the role of Hamlet's father's ghost, which is pretty cool. Let's see, what other ghosts do I want to talk about? I know. One of my favorites is Johann Kraus from the Hellboy comic books and the BPRD team. And then when he finally showed up in film in Hellboy 2, he got even more entertaining, I think, especially because of that like crazy voice that they went with Seth MacFarlane, of all people, did this fantastic over-the-top German accent. And so the story of Johann Kraus is that he was this 19th century spiritualism medium, as so many of them were, and so this guy comes to Johann, and he wants Johann to communicate with his dead loved one or his dead wife. And since Johann's a medium, he can do this. And so they gather in these seances, and Johann leaves his body in his etheric form above the table and starts communing with this client's dead wife. But then they keep talking to each other. Johann has to come back and like deliver messages, but they have such a good time talking with each other that he starts to fall in love with her and she starts to fall in love with him. And so there's like this secret little romance happening between the ghost of the dead woman who is being communicated with, and Johann, who's still technically alive, but has to come outside of it in temporary etheric form. And so there's this weird like secret affair, like paranormal affair going on with him, until one day when he's in one of these seances. In his etheric body, moved out of his physical body due to this blast wave of occult power from a completely unrelated problem going on in the Hellboy universe. He got his ties to his physical body got cut, and so he got stuck in this etheric form, but he never quite died, and so he wasn't subject to dissolving away and moving on to the afterlife, but he had to be held together in this as this ectoplasm, which for mediums is this kind of substance that's like half spirit and half humidity from your own bodies that seeps out of your pores. And so half body fluid, half spirit is this ectoplasm thing. Not typically kind of green and gooey like it is in the movie Ghostbusters, but it's funnier if it's green and gooey. So that's why Ghostbusters went with that. And so this ectoplasm etheric substance needs to be contained. And so he ends up having this suit built for him. And that it's like this, really old school, clunky kind of diver suit. And he stays in that. And every now and then he can open a valve and let himself out to possess something else or some dead body or someone else and to solve basic problems. And then he lets himself back into a suit and moves around. And that's a really cool character concept, and they do a lot of cool things with them in the comic books for sure, but also in that movie, I think. Who else do I want to talk about? I hesitate to talk about the one I want to talk. I want to talk just briefly about the Grey Host of Oathbreakers, because it's Tolkien, and I want to do a whole episode just on monsters and Tolkien. I also teach a Tolkien literature class in college, by the way, and so a lot of the Tolkien stuff that I want to talk about, I get my release. Yeah, I can get it out of my system in that class, so I feel less amped up to I need to talk about Tolkien now, and I want to save them up. But how about I'll just mention them briefly, because I probably won't even get around to them in the Tolkien Monster podcast, when we'll probably talk about Balrogs and Ringwraiths and Barrow-wights, and by the time that's done, and those are really complicated and complex, by the time that's done, I'll be out. So ever so briefly, the Grey Host of Oathbreakers. They're the men from Dunharrow, and these guys who lived in the mountains, and they were tough but independent and not all that trustworthy, and they were called upon to help Isildur in the last alliance fight against Sauron in his last stand. At the last second, when they needed him most, these guys turned tail and took off. And they're like, there's no way we're getting involved in this mess. We're better off on our own. We're going back to the mountains. And so they were all cursed and to linger as ghosts in this mountain pass. And in the book, in the third volume, so Return of the King, when Aragorn is leading their army through the mountain passes, and this crew, a branch of the army through the mountain passes, there's this door that they're passing, and that's the door of the dead, and there's still this skeleton clinging to this door, and the door is scarred up with where the skeleton banged his sword against it to get in and clawed at it until he died, and his bones were just left there. And he was a living man who wanted to get this door open. The dead built the door, the dead keep it, and there's something the dead are holding back behind this door. What is it? What are these dead men, these ghosts? Why do they build this door? What's on the other side? What are they holding back? Everybody, wants to know. As a reader, you're just dying to know. There's almost nothing in all of Lord of the Rings and in the connected mythology through the Silmarillion, almost nothing that's not completely explained, except that door. Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son, who's been a great steward of the estate since his father's passing, famously said that there were only a few things that weren't explicitly explained at some point or another in Tolkien's writings that ever show up. Of the five wizards that came to Middle Earth, we know very little about the two blue ones, right? We know about Radgast the Brown and Gandalf the Grey and Saruman the White, but what about the two blue ones? We don't know about the cats of Queen Beruthiel, which are referenced at one point in the books. But the thing is, he did write about those two blue wizards. Tolkien did write about the cats of Queen Beruthiel. He wrote about all these things that we say, like, only a few things he didn't follow through on. But that door, Christopher Tolkien doesn't mention. What's on the other side of that thing? What is it keeping back? It's not just the Grey Host. It's not just this army of ghosts. It's something else, and we never find out. Of all things in those books, we never find out. What are the dead keeping back? I can't help but think of Robert Frost's Witch of Coaz. Don't you think there's something the dead are keeping back? Yes, there is something the dead are keeping back. Oh, it's creepy. So at this point, if you're keeping up with podcasts as they're released, then it should be October. And if that's the case, then happy Halloween month. And I hope you enjoyed this episode on ghosts. And stay tuned for something next week that is deep into Halloween world. And my favorite time of the year, big surprise, my absolute favorite time of the year. I just consider the whole month to be that of Halloween on into a little bit of November, and it already started in September for me. And so I hope you have a great one. Stay tuned to find out what monster we're going to talk about next. Thank you for listening to The Monster Professor.